Hello everybody, this is chapter 7 of The Story of Yvette. Before we go on to chapter 7, let's do the questions from chapter 6. See how you got on with those. Okay. First question was, what was the name of the farmer who gave James all the homemade wine? Remember, that made him a bit merry? He was called Mr. Crump. So well done if you remembered his name. Question number 2, what kind of hat did Mr. Crump give to James as he left to go out in the rain? Remember when James staggered out because he'd had a bit too much wine too, and it was pouring with rain, and Mr. Crump gave him a hat. It was a flat cap, great big flat cap. It's too big for him really. And then the third question, farm that James went to, they were called the Bamfords. Did the Bamfords know that James was drunk? They were a bit worried. Siegfried was a bit worried in case they knew that James was a bit drunk. Do you think they knew? Yes, we think they definitely knew. But they didn't mind that much because James did a good job, didn't he? Anyway, next chapter. Okay. On to chapter 7 now. The silvery-haired old gentleman with the pleasant face didn't look the type to be easily upset, but his eyes glared at me angrily, and his lips quivered with indignation. "Mr. Herriot," he said, "I've come to make a complaint. I strongly object to your callousness in subjecting my job to unnecessary suffering." Suffering? What suffering? I was mystified. "I think you know, Mr. Herriot. I brought my dog in a few days ago. He was very lame, and I am referring to your treatment on that occasion." I nodded. Yes, I remember it well. But where does the suffering come in? "Well, the poor animal is going around with his leg dangling, and I have it on good authority that the bone is fractured and should have been put in plaster immediately." The old gentleman stuck his chin out fiercely. "All right, you can stop worrying," I said. "Your dog has a radial paralysis caused by a blow on the ribs, and if you are patient and follow my treatment, he'll gradually improve. In fact, I think he'll recover completely." "But he trails his leg when he walks." "I know, and that's typical. But he shows no sign of pain, does he?" "No, he seems quite happy. But this lady seemed to be absolutely sure of her facts. She was adamant." "What lady?" "Yes," said the old gentleman, "she is very clever with animals, and she came round to see if she could help with my dog's convalescence. She brought some excellent condition powders with her." Ah! A blinding shaft pierced the fog in my mind. All was suddenly clear. It was Mrs. Donovan, wasn't it? "Well, yes, that was her name." Old Mrs. Donovan was a woman who really got around. No matter what was going on in Darrowby, weddings, funerals, house sales, you'd find the dumpy little figure and walnut face among the spectators, the darting black button eyes taking everything in, and always, on the end of its lead, her terrier dog. When I say old, I'm only guessing, because she appeared ageless. She seemed to have been around a long time. She could have been anything between 55 and 75. She certainly had the vitality of a young woman, because she must have walked vast distances in her dedicated quest to keep abreast of events. Many people took an uncharitable view of her acute curiosity, but whatever the motivation, her activities took her into almost every channel of life in the town. One of those channels was our veterinary practice. Because Mrs. Donovan, among her other widely ranging interests, was an animal doctor. In fact, I think it would be safe to say that this part of her life transcended all others. She could talk at length on the ailments of small animals and she had a whole armoury of medicines and remedies at her command, her two specialities being her miracle working condition powders and a dog shampoo of unprecedented value for improving the coat. She had an uncanny ability to sniff out a sick animal, and it was not uncommon, when I was on my rounds, to find Mrs. Donovan's dark gypsy face poised intently over what I thought was my patient, while she administered calf's foot jelly or one of her own made-up remedies. I suffered more than Siegfried, because I took a more active part in the small animal side of our practice. I was anxious to develop this aspect and to improve my image in this field, and Mrs. Donovan didn't help at all. Young Mr. Herriot, she would confide to my clients, is all right with cattle and such like, but he don't know nothing about dogs and cats. And of course they believed her, and had implicit faith in her. She had the irresistible mystical appeal of the amateur, and on top of that there was her habit, of particularly endearing in Darrowby, of never changing her advice, her medicines, her long periods of diligent nursing. There was no smile on her face, however, on the day when she rushed into the surgery, while Siegfried and I were having tea. "Mr. Herriot," she gasped, "can you come? My little dog's been run over." I jumped up and ran out to the car with her. She sat in the passenger seat with her head bowed, her hands clasped tightly on her knees. "He slipped his collar and ran in front of my car," she murmured. "He's lying in front of the school hallway, up Cliff End Road. Please hurry." I was there within 3 minutes, but as I bent over the dusty little body stretched on the pavement, I knew there was nothing I could do. "I'll take him back to the surgery and get some saline into him, Mrs. Donovan," I said, "but I'm afraid he's had a massive internal hemorrhage. Did you see what happened exactly?" She gulped. "Yes, the wheel went right over him." Ruptured liver, for sure. I passed my hands under the little animal and began to lift him gently, but as I did so the breathing stopped and the eyes stared ahead. Mrs. Donovan sank to her knees, and for a few moments she gently stroked the rough hair of the head and chest. "He's gone, isn't he?" she whispered at last. "I'm afraid so," I said. She got slowly to her feet and stood bewilderedly among the little group of bystanders on the pavement. Her lips moved, but she seemed unable to say any more. I took her arm, led her over to the car and opened the door. "Get in and sit down. I'll run you home. Leave everything to me." I wrapped the dog in my carving overall and laid him in the boot before driving away. It wasn't until we drew up outside Mrs. Donovan's house that she began to weep silently. I sat there without speaking till she'd finished. Then she wiped her eyes and turned to me. "Do you think he suffered at all?" "I'm certain he didn't. It was all so quick. He wouldn't know a thing about it." She tried to smile. "Poor little Rex. I don't know what I'm going to do without him. We've travelled a few miles together, you know." "Yes, you have. He had a wonderful life, Mrs. Donovan. And let me give you a bit of advice. You must get another dog. You'd be lost without one." She shook her head. No, I couldn't. That little dog meant too much to me. I couldn't let another take his place." "Well, I know how you feel just now, but I wish you'd think about it. I tell everybody this when they lose an animal, and I know it's good advice." "Mr. Herriot, I'll never get another one." She shook her head again very decisively. "Rex was my faithful friend for many years, and I just want to remember him. He's the last dog I'll ever have." I often saw Mrs. Donovan around the town after this, and I was glad to see that she was still as active as ever. Though she looked strangely incomplete without the little dog on its lead. But it must have been over a month before I had the chance to speak to her. It was on the afternoon that Inspector Halliday of the RSPCA rang me up. "Mr. Herriot," he said, "I'd like you to come and see an animal with me, a cruelty case." "Right. What is it?" "It's a dog, and it's pretty grim. A dreadful case of neglect." He gave me the name of a row of old brick cottages down by the river and said he'd meet me there. Inspector Halliday was waiting for me, smart and businesslike in his dark uniform, as I pulled up in the back lane behind the house. He was a big blond man with cheerful blue eyes, but he didn't smile as he came over to the car. "He's in here," he said, and led the way towards one of the doors in the long crumbling wall. A few curious people were hanging around, and, as usual, I recognised Mrs. Donovan. Trust Mrs. Donovan, I thought, to be among those present at a time like this. We went through the door into the long garden. We found a garden, but it was a wilderness. A chilling air of desolation hung over the few gnarled apple and plum trees standing among a tangle of rank grass, as though the place had been forsaken by all living creatures. Inspector Halliday went over to a ramshackle wooden shed, peeling paint and a rusty corrugated iron roof. He produced a key, unlocked the padlock, and dragged the door partly open. There was no window, and it wasn't easy to identify the jumble inside. Broken gardening tools, an ancient mangle, rows of flower pots and partly used paint tins. And right at the back, a dog sitting quietly. I didn't notice him immediately because of the gloom and because the smell in the shed started me coughing. But as I drew closer, I saw that he was a big animal, sitting very upright, his collar secured by a chain to a ring in the wall. I have seen some thin dogs, but never as bad as this. There was a deep, smoothed-out hollow in the earth floor, showing where he had lain, moved about, and in fact lived for a very long time. The sight of the animal had a stupefying effect on me. I only half took in the rest of the scene, the filthy shreds of sacking nearby, the bowl of scummy water. The inspector spoke. "I don't think he's ever been out of here. He's only a young dog, about a year old, but I understand he's been in this shed since he was an 8-week-old pup. Somebody out in the lane heard a whimper, or he'd never have been found." I felt a tightening of the throat and suddenly felt sick. It was the thought of this patient animal, sitting starved and forgotten in the darkness and filth for a whole year. I looked again at the dog and saw in his eyes only a calm trust. Some dogs would have barked their heads off and soon been discovered. Some would have become terrified and vicious, but this was one of the totally undemanding kind, the kind which had complete faith in people and accepted all their actions without complaint. Just an occasional whimper, perhaps, as he sat in the empty blackness which had been his world, and at times wondered what it was all about. "Well, Inspector, I hope you're going to throw the book at whoever was responsible," I said. Halliday grunted. "Oh, there won't be much done. It's a case of diminished responsibility. The owner's definitely simple. Lives with an aged mother who hardly knows what's going on either. I've seen the fellow, and it seems he threw in a bit of food when he felt like it, and that's about all he did. They'll fine him and stop him keeping an animal in the future, but nothing more than that." "I see." I reached out and stroked the dog's head, and he immediately responded by resting a paw on my wrist. There was a pathetic dignity about the way he held himself erect, the calm eyes regarding me friendly and unafraid. "Well, you'll let me know if you want me in court." "Of course, and thank you for coming along." Halliday hesitated for a moment. I turned to Halliday. "You know, Inspector, inside this bag of bones there's a lovely, healthy golden retriever. I wish there was some way of letting him out." As I spoke, I noticed there was more than one figure in the door opening. A pair of black pebble eyes were peering intently at the big dog from behind the inspector's broad back. The other spectators had remained in the lane, but Mrs. Donovan's curiosity had been too much for her. I continued conversationally as though I hadn't seen her. "You know what this dog needs, first of all, is a good shampoo to clean up his matted coat." "Eh?" said Halliday. "Yes, and then he wants a long course of some really strong conditioning powders." "What's that?" The inspector looked startled. "There's no doubt about it," I said. "It's the only hope for him." "But where are you going to find such things?" "Really powerful enough, I mean." I sighed and straightened up. "Ah, well, I suppose there's nothing else for it. I'll get my things from my car." When I got back to the shed, Mrs. Donovan was already inside examining the dog, despite the feeble remonstrances of the big man. "Look," she was saying excitedly, pointing to a name roughly scratched on the collar. "His name's Roy." She smiled up at me. "It's a bit like Rex, isn't it, that name?" "No, Mrs. Donovan, now you mention it, it is. It's very like Rex, the way it rolls off the tongue." I nodded seriously. She stood silent for a few moments, obviously in the grip of deep emotion, and then she burst out. "Can I have him? I can make him better. I know I can. Please, please let me have him." "Well, I don't know. It's really up to the inspector. You'll have to get his permission." Halliday looked at her in bewilderment, and then he said, "Excuse me, madam," and drew me to one side. We walked a few yards through the long grass and stopped under a tree. "Mr. Herriot," he whispered, "I don't know what's going on, but I can't just pass over an animal in this condition to anybody who has a casual whim. The poor beggar's had one bad break already. I think it's enough. This woman doesn't look like a suitable person." I held up a hand. "Believe me, Inspector, you've nothing to worry about. She's a funny old stick, but she's been sent from heaven today. If anybody in Durrowby can give this dog a new life, it's her." Halliday still looked very doubtful. "I'll tell you something. What he needs," I said, "is a lot of good grub, care, affection, and that's just what he'll get from Mrs. Donovan. You can take my word for it." "All right, you seem very sure." Halliday looked over at me for a second or two, then turned and walked over to the eager little figure by the shed. I'd never before been deliberately on the lookout for Mrs. Donovan. She had just cropped up whenever I happened to be. But now I scanned the streets of Darrowby anxiously day by day without sighting her. Oh, pardon me. I didn't like it when Gobber Newhouse got drunk and drove his bicycle determinedly through a barrier with a 10-foot hole where they were laying the new sewer, and Mrs. Donovan was not in evidence among the happy crowd who watched the council workmen and 2 policemen trying to get him out. Maybe I should have called round to see how she was getting on with that dog. Certainly I had trimmed off the tissue and dressed the sores before she took him away. But perhaps he needed something more than that. And yet at the time I had felt a strong conviction that the main thing was to get him out of there and clean him and feed him, and nature would do the rest. And I had a lot of faith in Mrs. Donovan, far more than she had in me. It must have been nearly 3 weeks, and I was on the point of calling at her home when I noticed her stumping briskly along the far side of the marketplace, peering closely into every shop window exactly as before. The only difference was that she had a big yellow dog on the end of the lead. I turned the wheel and sent my car bumping over the cobbles till I was abreast of her. When she saw me getting out, she stopped and smiled, but didn't speak, as I bent over Roy and examined him. He was still a skinny dog, but he looked bright and happy. His wounds were healthy, and there was not a speck of dirt in his coat or on his skin. I knew then what Mrs. Donovan had been doing all this time. She had been washing and combing and teasing at that filthy tangle till she had finally conquered it. As I straightened up, she seized my wrist in a grip of surprising strength and looked up into my eyes. "Now, Mr. Elliot," she said, "haven't I made a difference to this dog?" "You've done wonders, Mrs. Donovan," I said. "And you've been at him with that marvellous shampoo of yours, haven't you?" She giggled and walked away, and from that day I saw the two of them frequently, but at a distance, and something like 2 months went by before I had a chance to talk to her again. She was passing by the surgery as I was coming down the steps, and again she grabbed my wrist. "Mr. Elliot," she said, just as she'd done before, "haven't I made a difference to this dog?" I looked down at Roy with something like awe. He had grown and filled out, and his coat, no longer yellow but a rich gold, lay in luxuriant shining swathes over the well-fleshed ribs and back. A new brightly studded collar glittered on his neck, and his tail, beautifully fringed, fanned the air gently. He was now a golden retriever in full magnificence. As I stared at him, he reared up, plunked his forepaws on my chest and looked up into my face, and in his eyes I read plainly the same calm affection and trust I'd seen back in that black, dreadful shed. "Mrs. Donovan," I said, "he is the most beautiful dog in Yorkshire." Then, because I knew she was waiting for it, "It's those wonderful condition powders. Whatever do you put in them?" "Ah, wouldn't you like to know?" She bridled and smiled up at me, and indeed she was nearer being kissed at that moment than for many years. I suppose you could say that that was the start of Roy's second life, and as the years passed I often pondered on the beneficence which had decreed that an animal which had spent his first 12 months abandoned and unwanted, staring into that unchanging, stinking darkness, could be whisked in a moment to an existence of light and movement and love. Because I don't think any dog had it quite so good as Roy from then on. His diet changed dramatically from odd bread crusts to best stewing steak and biscuit, meaty bones, and a bowl of warm milk every evening. And he never missed a thing. Garden fetes, school sports, evictions, gymkhanas, he'd be there. I was pleased to note that as time went on, Mrs. Donovan seemed to be clocking up an even greater daily mileage. Mrs. Donovan didn't confine her activities to the town centre. There was a big stretch of common land down by the river where there were seats, and people used to take their dogs for a gallop, and she liked to get down there fairly regularly to check on the latest developments on the domestic scene. I often saw Roy loping majestically over the grass among a pack of assorted dogs, and when he wasn't doing that, he was submitting to being stroked or patted or generally fussed over. He was handsome, and he just liked people. It made him irresistible. Mrs. Donovan had her reward. She had a faithful companion by her side every hour of the day and night. But there was more to it than that. She had always had the compulsion to help and heal animals, and the salvation of Roy was the high point of her life, a blazing triumph which never dimmed. Whenever I saw her, over those years, she'd always come over, and I felt the familiar tight grip on my wrist. "Mr. Elliot," she'd say, with the dark, probing eyes, which was full of pride and warmth, the triumph still as bursting new as if it had all happened yesterday. "Mr. Elliot, haven't I made a difference to this dog?" So, was chapter 7. It was a bit sad at the beginning, wasn't it? And then it got cheerful. That poor old dog, well, not old, poor dog, being neglected, being left, hadn't it? But then Mrs. Donovan came into his life. So, let's have some questions for that chapter and then see how you get on, and I'll do the answers the next time. So the first question was, what's the name of the lady whose dog gets run over? Okay. So the lady in the chapter, her little dog gets run over. What's her name? Question 2. What kind of dog is Roy? So the second dog the lady gets, the one she rescues, what's his name? And then what's the name of the RSPCA inspector who rang James and asked him to go to see the poor dog? So the inspector in the smart uniform with the blue eyes, what's his name? Okay, see how you get on with those questions. And I'll see you next time. Bye-bye for now.